You guys are probably familiar, I would imagine, with the names Lewis and Clark. Imagine. Individually, probably not. If I told you their individual names, you'd be like, who's that guy? But Lewis and Clark together, you're familiar probably with that name association. Lewis and Clark were Army officers. They were commissioned by Thomas Jefferson in 1804 to find a passageway through the western part of the United States to the Pacific Ocean. The purpose for the commission was they were trying to find a commerce route. So Jefferson wanted to establish an efficient route for trade from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so he commissioned Lewis and Clark to lead this expedition. Now the assumption was, when they started, that the land west of the Mississippi River would be the same as the land east of the Mississippi River. So the assumption was basically that they were going to find a waterway, that if they traveled the Missouri River north, that they would find a sort of nice, gently sloping waterway that would lead them to the Pacific Ocean. So when they set out on the expedition, they took canoes. That was their plan. They were going to canoe their way to the Pacific Ocean. And that plan was working just fine until they hit what? The Rocky Mountains. Which, John Denver is not full of crap. They are very rocky. You're not canoeing your way through the Rocky Mountains. So when they got to the Rocky Mountains, what had been true was no longer true. What they expected is not what they got. Now, they were committed to the mission. The mission was to find this pathway to the Pacific Ocean. They were committed to that. They weren't going to give up on it, but they realized we're going to have to adapt our strategies here, right? Canoes are not going to work anymore. And they were able to adapt their strategy because they were explorers. They were trained. I mean, they were deeply formed as wilderness wanderers. They knew what they were doing. Right? That story, the Lewis and Clark story, is the controlling metaphor in a book called Canoeing the Mountains. And it's a book about the mission of the church. The author, Todd Bolsinger, he basically argues that what was once true concerning the relationship between the church and culture, what was once true is no longer true. And what the church expected to continue to be true is not what it has. Right? We've sort of run into mountains where we expected to find a waterway. And so if the church is going to stay true to its mission, one, it has to understand what that mission is, and it has to be committed to it. But then in addition to that, it has to be able to adapt. It has to adapt its strategies. But in order to adapt, the people of the church have to be deeply formed in the ways of Jesus in order to be able to innovate in terrain that is unexpected. So for the next 4 weeks, this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the mission of the church. We're going to talk about what is the mission. We'll talk a little bit about that this morning. But then we're going to spend our time talking about the sort of uncharted territory that the church finds itself in. I don't know if any of you know this, right? That sort of what used to be true regarding the relationship between the church and culture isn't true anymore. That we, for a long time, we just sort of expected things to go a certain way, and they didn't go that way. So we're in a very different world than we were 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. And nobody has any idea where it's going. So we have to be able to adapt if we're going to stay true to the mission of the church. But in order to adapt, what's it going to take for us to become the kinds of people who are formed so deeply in the ways of Jesus that when we encounter unexpected territory, we can just do it. We just know what we're doing because we're deeply formed in that. Right? The text that we're going to work out of is in Luke chapter 19. This is if you're a seasoned church person, this is a very well-known story. If you're not, I'm going to read the story to you, so it doesn't matter. It's about a guy named Zacchaeus. This is how the story goes. Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd, so he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. "Zacchaeus," he said, "quick, come down. I must be a guest at your home today." Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. "He's gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner," they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, "I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord, and if I've cheated people on their taxes," which he did, "I will give them back 4 times as much." Jesus responded, "Salvation has come to this home today. For this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save those who are lost." I didn't choose this passage. This passage was chosen for me, but I don't know that you could pick a better one to highlight the mission of the church, globally or locally, for us as an individual church here. At the beginning of the story, you have a man who, to use Jesus' language, is lost. He's lost. And what Jesus seems to mean by that is you have a person who has spent the better part of his adult life taking advantage of other people in order to make himself rich. Which, if you didn't know this, is a drastic violation of God's good intentions for the way that human beings are supposed to relate to one another. It is a great picture of someone who he has a certain type of human existence. He's alive, but he's not living. Not the way God designs and intends for people to live. Jesus calls him lost. Whatever his understanding of God, whatever his relationship to God, it obviously doesn't matter. It's not directing or dictating or controlling what he does and does not do, and how he thinks and what he values, and most importantly, how he thinks about other people and how he treats them, how he relates to them. He's lost. That's the beginning of the story. That's how Jesus finds him. Then he has this meaningful encounter with Jesus. Right? He shows up. He's too short. He can't see over the crowd. He climbs a tree. Jesus finds him, calls him by name. Right? Which you don't have to look at that and think that's like some supernatural thing. Zacchaeus was probably a very well-known figure. He's the chief tax collector in the region. He's like the county auditor. Everybody knows the name. It's on every gas pump. Right? Jesus looks up and says, "Oh, Zacchaeus." Right? What's surprising about the story is that Jesus says, "I need to be a guest in your home," which is a very intimate thing. You're going to go be a guest in someone's home. Hospitality is a serious thing in Jesus' culture, and nobody wants to be a guest in Zacchaeus' house. Because Zacchaeus is a tax collector. Zacchaeus is a notorious sinner. Zacchaeus is somebody who takes advantage of people. So Jesus says, "I want to be with you," which would have been, I think, a shocking thing for Zacchaeus to hear. So Zacchaeus has this meaningful encounter with Jesus. It's surprising. And then by the end of the story, his whole life has changed. And I'm not talking about some he prayed a prayer and now he gets to go to heaven when he dies kind of stuff. The orientation of his life has changed. He was someone who, his lifestyle, his decisions, his pursuits, his values made people poor. Now, he's taking half of his wealth and giving it to the poor. Where before he was cheating people in order to make himself rich, now he's going out and identifying all of the people whom he's cheated, and he's repaying them 4 times what he took from them in the first place, which was part of their law. That's what you did when you cheated somebody, if you actually wanted to be repentant. That's why Jesus says he's a true son of Abraham. He's getting it. He's lost. He has this meaningful encounter with Jesus, and it transforms the way he lives. He now is becoming someone who is starting to know God more deeply, and the way in which he's coming to know God is changing the way that he lives with people. Jesus calls that salvation. That's what salvation is. Salvation isn't some magical otherworldly thing. Salvation's the word that we use to describe when a human being starts to live rightly with God and people. Zacchaeus goes from lost to found. Salvation has come to this house. That's what we're trying to capture. When we talk about the mission of our church, here, Waterville Community Church, when we talk about our mission as being to produce people who love God and love people, this is the image that we have in mind. Right? It's our sticky way of reframing, to use Jesus' language, making disciples. So at the end of his life, after his death, after his resurrection, but before ascending back into heaven, Jesus gathers his followers on a mountaintop, and he has this commissioning conversation with them in the end of Matthew's gospel. And essentially what he says to them is, okay, everybody, it's time for me to physically leave you. I'm not leaving you. I'm always going to be with you. But physically, I'm going away. So now what's going to happen is I'm going to continue my work through you. You're not continuing my work. I'm continuing my work through you. That's an important distinction. You are going to become my embodiment in the world, not as an individual, but as a collective. As the way that you live together, you effectively are going to go out into the world, and you're going to do everywhere what I've been doing here. And that is to make disciples. The word disciple just means student. Student of whom? Jesus. That's that baptism language. Jesus, I want you to go into the world, and I want you to baptize people in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Baptism is not some magical spiritual act. Baptism is a political act. In the ancient world, baptism is a political act. It is a pledge of allegiance. It is a public declaration that you are leaving one community and you are entering another. That you are rescinding your allegiance to one Lord and you are pledging your allegiance to another. It's a political act. So when Jesus says, go into the world and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, what he's saying is, you, as my embodiment, you're going to go out into the world. Okay? And you are going to create the meaningful encounters that the Zacchaeuses of the world get to have with me, through you. And that's going to be an invitation for them, right? To leave one community and enter another. Give up their allegiance to one Lord and pledge it to me. And then you're going to teach them. Right? Again, disciple, student. You're going to teach them. What are you going to teach them? Teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you. Because that's what it means to be a student, to be an apprentice. You're going to learn from me how to live. You're not going to learn from somebody. You're going to learn from me. I'm going to be your authority. I'm going to be your teacher. What is it that Jesus taught us to do? And there's a lot of, if you've read the Bible, there's a lot of commands in this book. The Bible's not short on commands. It kind of likes commands. There's a lot of laws in here. Jesus would say, well, here, let me make it simple for you. We'll just sort of reduce this down so you get the spirit of it. The summation of the commands is to love God, heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, so if there's a law out there that you think you're supposed to follow, but somehow the way you understand that law is not a reflection of your love for God, or is not actually causing you to love a person, you took a misstep somewhere. That what it means to obey everything that Jesus taught you is to love God, heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to express that love by the way that you love people. So that's why we say our mission statement is to produce people who love God and love people. It's just a simple substitution. Right? Jesus says, go make disciples. What's a disciple? A student of Jesus. Someone who's learning to obey everything Jesus taught. What did Jesus teach? Love God, love people. So you just substitute. The mission of the church. Jesus said, this is why the church exists. God is actually trying to do something in the world, and the vehicle through which God does that work is the church. It has a job to do. That's the only reason it's here. The only reason you're here. I'm here. And that mission is to produce people who love God and love people. It's to take people who don't, like Zacchaeus, are lost, don't know what it's like to live in right relationship with God and people, to create meaningful encounters with Jesus for them so that their lives can change, that they can become the kinds of people who start to live rightly with God and with other people and can help others do the same, right? And there's this sort of cascading. That's the mission of the church. That's why we're here. You need to be clear about that. It's why the church exists. Now let's talk about the terrain that we find ourselves in. What we understand as sort of colonial America has always had a very strange relationship with the Christian church. We have always just kind of assumed, and I don't, to some degree, strangely, we still do. We've always just kind of assumed that we're sort of a Christian people. That's just was. I mean, I was at a football game yesterday at Notre Dame Stadium, and at the beginning of the football game, they always read the preamble to the Constitution, and you hear that language, and it's like we are dependent on divine providence, that we believe that human beings are endowed with certain inalienable rights. I mean, there's this God-drenched, God-soaked language, right? There's just this general assumption, and this has always been true of sort of colonial American identity, that we have a sort of general Christian ethos value system about us. I don't know that that's ever been actually true, but it was always assumed to be true. It's very hard to make the argument that when you build a society on the backs of slaves that you're a genuinely Christian society. But it was always the assumption, okay? And to some degree, it was for a very long time that we have a general Christian identity about us. And because of that, because that was the assumption, the church just never really had to be the church. Because you just kind of assume that everybody's in on it, right? You don't, people are just going to come to church because they come to church, because it's what we do. And everybody, it's just part of the general culture. And when things are part of general culture, you don't talk about them. It's never explicit. It's always implicit. It's just in the water. It's just how we live. So for generations, quite literally centuries, this is just how kind of American culture and Christianity have sort of gone together. The assumption was that the land west of the Mississippi would continue to be like the land east of the Mississippi, right? That the way things went will be the way things that will go. We had a certain expectation for how society and culture would just continue to be formed and shaped. And so we packed canoes and went on our way. But we never had to actually be deeply formed in the ways of Jesus. Because when everybody's kind of implicitly in on it, I mean, who is there to really reach? We're all just kind of do this. And so where we find ourselves now is not only is the general culture in which we live not being generally formed or shaped by a Christian identity at all, but the church is largely considered irrelevant. I mean, it's not even hostile anymore. We've gotten past hostility. It's now to the place of complete irrelevance. And you've ever been in a situation, if you're like super angry with someone, there's still hope. When you get to the point where you just simply don't care anymore, we're pretty much done. That's the place where culture is with church. It's way past hostility. It's to the place of like, we don't even care what the church thinks anymore. The church is just not a conversation partner anymore in most places. Nobody cares. That's the world in which we live. It's the unexpected terrain in which we find ourselves. You can't just keep doing what you've been doing and expect to be successful with the mission, because the terrain has changed. So what we have to do, if we're going to stay true to the mission, which is, you'll see was one of my grow questions at the end of the message, you'll have to decide if the mission is something you actually care about. I mean, if you want to be true to it, personally or collectively. But if you do, and you want to be true to the mission, you have to adapt. And that is to say that you have to become the kinds of people who can adapt. So that the way that we live our lives together in this kind of new world that none of us really get and none of us know where it's going, that the way in which we live together has a certain impact. So I want you to think about Zacchaeus for a minute. Zacchaeus hears that Jesus is coming to town, and he takes the time to show up. He braves the crowd. He climbs a tree to see Jesus. Now, I don't know if it's fair to say that Zacchaeus is a adequate representative of the typical Anthony Wayne resident. I mean, like Zacchaeus, I'm not saying we're all short. Some of you are, though. Most of us have everything that we need and want materially. I mean, I know that's not true of all of us, but most of the people who live in our local community, like Zacchaeus, are rich. Let's just say it. Yes, there are gradations of richness, but we're rich. I have everything I could possibly want or need materially. And that's true of most of the people I know who live out here. That comes at a cost for a lot of us. I mean, like Zacchaeus, having everything you need and want sometimes comes at the cost of knowing who you are. Or more importantly, knowing who you're supposed to be. And then furthermore, knowing how you'd possibly get there. I mean, Zacchaeus shows up. I don't know what that means for him. I don't know if it means he's spiritually restless. I don't know if it's like he's got big existential questions he doesn't have answers for. Maybe he was just curious and bored that day. I don't know. What I can say is that for some reason, he felt compelled to come and see Jesus that day. Something in his life or something lacking in his something, he showed up. I'd like to suggest that it had something to do with the reputation that preceded Jesus. You know, Jesus was known as a friend of tax collectors and sinners. It's something Luke says just a few chapters before this one, that this was how Jesus was known. That when you thought of Jesus, you thought that guy, that religious guy, that rabbi, that pastor, he's a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Which is exactly who Zacchaeus was. And let's look, Zacchaeus didn't have any friends. I mean, if you're someone like Zacchaeus, you get shunned by everybody because of the way that you live your life. And whether or not he was kind of formally excluded from the worshiping community, I don't know, but I can't imagine he'd felt welcome there. So as I think about people who live in our communities, I think about myself. I have everything that I could need or want. I'm not saying that we've spent our whole lives cheating other people to get it. Though I will say in a complex global economy, you'd have a hard time arguing that you didn't. That we have everything that we could need or want. But I've met tons of people who don't know who they are. And they don't know who they're supposed to be. And they have no idea how to get there. But unlike Zacchaeus, right? Who for somehow he thought, maybe this Jesus guy has an answer for me. The vast majority of people do not think, yes, the church, that's where I'll go. I know the church will be able to help me deal with my questions and my doubt and my confusion, and maybe the church could help me with my struggling marriage or with my struggling children or with my own sense of struggling identity. Yes, of course, the church, that's where I will go. And part of the reason for that is because the church, for hundreds of years in our culture, hasn't cared for its reputation. The reputation that precedes us to a lot of people as the body of Christ, right? This embodiment of Jesus in the world. The Zacchaeuses of the world don't hear church and immediately think, I should go check that out. There's something intriguing about those people. That's the way that it's supposed to be. That you and I are supposed to live our lives together in such a way that our reputation generates some level of intrigue. Because that's how it has to work in a world that's changing. You can't just say, do A and it'll work. Do B and it'll work. It's not so much a strategy as much as it's about who you actually are as a person, who we are as a group of people. So that when you go out into the world and you step into these always shifting, changing environments, the way in which you live your life just generates a certain level of positive intrigue. Another way to think about this is rebranding. You know, when you see a corporate logo, you think of something. Immediately, you think of something. If I just started flashing corporate logos up on the screen, you'd see a logo and you would immediately go, oh yeah, that's that company, and this is, you have an impression of that company just based on the logo, based on the way that they've cared for their reputation. One of the things that we have to do if we're going to be true to our mission, which is the only reason we're here, is we got to rebrand. You got to rebrand. You got to change the story. You got to change the reputation that kind of goes out in front of us. Well, how do you do that? Well, for a long time, what the church did was it just engaged in marketing ploys. You just change the packaging. You dress it up. Yeah, we'll do music differently. We'll add cool lights, or we'll build impressive buildings, or we'll whatever. You just dress it up. Make it look better to people. And like any marketing ploy, yeah, you'll probably have some superficial impact up front. But eventually, people still have to engage the same product. And if your product stinks, right? And you know what the product is, right? The product's you. You're the product. Okay? I'm not saying you stink, but here's what I'm saying. If you don't actually change, right? So if the person who says, I pledge my allegiance to Jesus, I follow Christ, if that person or the group of people who say we pledge our allegiance to Jesus, if they go out into the world, in their homes and in their neighborhoods and in their workplaces and at the soccer field and wherever, if we go out into the world and there's nothing fundamentally different or better about our lives compared to people who couldn't give two rips about Jesus, well, then why in the world would we ever expect somebody who's struggling with anything to think the church could be a place that I could go? Because I'm looking at the people of the church and I don't see anything better about their lives compared to my life. They clearly don't have an answer I don't have. You can't just repackage it. The actual product has to get better. So that when people actually engage the product, they go, this is a different kind of place. These people actually think differently. And more importantly, they live differently. That's what this is about. It's about formation, right? We have a mission. The terrain has changed. You've got to be able to adapt. But if you're going to adapt, you got to be formed. It can't be inauthentic. You actually have to be the real deal to know how to shift and move in a changing environment. Because in times of stress, and you know this, you've experienced this, and some of you have experienced this, I'm guessing, recently. In times of stress, when life turns up the heat, when you find yourself in an unexpected environment, you do not revert to your logic. You do not revert to what you know. You revert to deep patterning. We have all been patterned. Most of us have spent our entire lives coming to church, but being patterned in the world. So when life throws something at you that you don't expect, as much as you would like to believe that you are like Jesus, in those moments, you are experiencing who you actually are. Because you don't fall back on what you know. You always have to know before you can do, but being able to do is much, much broader than just knowing, right? You know the values of our church are know, grow, go. Many of you know that. When we talk about the values of our church, can you throw that slide up there, Brian? Our values are it's knowing God in Christ, it's growing in our faith, and it's going where God sends us. Knowing God in Christ is like the seed planted. Jesus is how we know God. Jesus is the person to whom we are apprenticing ourselves. Going is about obedience. It's the fruit that gets produced. It's your character. It's your relationships. It's how you live in the world. It's the fruit produced. It's about obedience. It's about actually living your life in such a way that Jesus actually has authority to tell you what to do. And you listen to it. But to get from knowing to going, you got to grow. You have to actually be formed and patterned in a new way. Because when you step into the unexpected, you don't revert to just the things that you know. You revert to how you've been formed, how you've been shaped. And that is much, much, much deeper than just things that you're learning. It's a patterning of your psychology. It's literally a patterning of your body. How you use your actual body. So in order for us to be true to the mission of the church and to accomplish it in this changing world that we're in, we have to become people who are deeply formed. Another way for you to think about this is if you're ever going to be the subject of the mission of the church, the doer of it, If you're ever going to become someone who can actually go out into the world and produce someone who loves God and loves people, which is what you're here for, you have to become serious about being the object of the mission. That is to say, you have to become the kind of person in whom the church does this work of formation, that you allow yourself to be deeply formed and patterned in the way of Jesus, as opposed to the ways of the world. Okay? So that's where we're going. Over the next 3 weeks, what we're going to roll out for you is our strategy for helping you to become deeply formed in the ways of Jesus. Right? So the strategy is not, well, I hope they come to church occasionally and cross my fingers and maybe listen and eventually I hope it happens. That's not our strategy. We're going to roll out for you a three-dimensional strategy. We call it our discipleship pathway. It's three-dimensional. It's upward, it's inward, and it's outward. That's our language. Upward is about your relationship with God. You think about it as your identity. We're going to talk about what it's going to look like. What practices will you have to engage in order to form an identity that is rooted in God through Christ in the Spirit, right? We're going to talk about inward, our relationships with one another. Remember, we don't embody Jesus just as individuals. We embody Jesus in the world as a collective, the way that we relate to one another, our relationships. So forming certain kinds of relationships is central to our formation as a Christian group. So we'll talk about inward. We'll spend time talking about outward. This is our vocation. And by vocation, I don't mean what you do to earn a living. I mean the vocation that God gives you as people who are supposed to go out into the world and bear witness to a different kind of reality. And we'll talk about how these dimensions interrelate and sort of the steps or whatever. But what I want you to know today is that the church has a mission. It's to produce people who love God and love people. That is a mission that we're deeply committed to. It is our only purpose for existing. That the world in which we live is changing faster than any of us can kind of get our heads around. And if we're going to stay true to the mission, we've got to become people who are adaptable. And that only happens if we're deeply formed in the ways of Jesus. When you become deeply formed in the ways of Jesus, you start moving beyond just being the object of mission and you can start being the subject of it, right? And then you can begin to rebrand the way that people think about Christianity, but more importantly, the way people think about God. The way they think about themselves, the way they think about other people, and ultimately the way they think about life, right? They can have a Zacchaeus experience. They can go from being lost to found, right? Living to actual life. So a couple questions for you to think about this morning as we wrap up with communion here. I just want you to ask yourself, do you understand the mission of the church, and how important to you is it? I mean, just be honest. Do you understand what the mission is, and how important is it to you? Could you sort of take it or leave it? Or is it important to you to engage in this process of producing people who love God and love people? It's something for you to wrestle with. And then do you sense in yourself the need to be formed more deeply in the ways of Jesus? Do you have that recurring experiences of like, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I just can't seem to do it? That if I'm actually going to engage in the mission effectively, I have to change. My life has to change. And that's not something that just happens because I want it to or because I think it can, but because I have to engage in different practices. We're going to finish our services